Hi everybody, coming to you from my kitchen. We'll see how long I last. I'm just going to give you the hard, cold truth before you get to start in on your activity for the day. The thing about measuring, both volunteers themselves, evaluating the volunteers, and evaluating the volunteer programs that we have, is one of those things that has to do with, if junk goes in, junk comes out. The very most important thing to know about measuring is that you have to decide what you need or want to measure before you even get started. And I know that people kind of get nervous about measuring things, evaluating things, for a lot of reasons. One is there are ads for software to help you measure stuff all over the place. And so we tend to think that people who are smarter than we are designed these measuring tools. But the truth is they're just automating something that you could automate or you could do by yourself. And even when you get some amazing software, you still have to tell it what is important to measure. And two, we tend to think that there's going to be math involved. And maybe there's going to be counting involved and that sort of thing. But regardless, if we know what we want to count and why it's important to count it, suddenly all of that math stuff seems like just a tool to get us what we need. And three, the more data that you actually keep track of, the easier it is for your organization to justify the money that you ask for from your grant funders and your donors. And four, and this might be the most important of all, we spent all this time thinking about how we could use or engage volunteers to help us further the mission. How the heck are we going to know if we are succeeding at any of that if we don't decide in advance what that looks like and then measure how far toward it we have come? So those are the big 4 points I want to make. Now, one of your readings looks like this. I don't know why they call it the hidden workforce, but I honestly, this cover makes me want to go get my crayons out. But I'm going to go right past this cover and right past all this verbiage and to these pages down here. And what I want to point out to you, and you don't have to just watch this on the video, you can pull up your own piece of paper. This whole thing, which I'm going through very fast, but you see there's a lot of sections to it. You don't necessarily have to evaluate absolutely everything in here. But I love this because it is a great example of all of the things that there are that you could evaluate. And it just helps you understand to think more, beyond what you might otherwise. I think most of us naturally go to thinking about evaluating numbers. So, if we had an event and we needed 150 volunteers, the question is, did we get our 150 volunteers? That's easy to count, right? If we're trying to keep track of those volunteer hours so that we can show it as pro bono time donations as part of our value scheme, then that's another thing we have to take, not just counting, but keeping track of hours. But there's so many other things that we could keep track of. And also we want to talk about what is it that we want to know. So there's several levels of things that we want to know, especially when we're talking about volunteers. Yes, we want to count how many show up. Yes, we want to keep track of how many hours they work so that we can put a monetary value on it for whatever those reasons are. But also we want to know if the way we've got the program set up is successful, if we're having good retention of our volunteers based on the way we're doing things, if the impact that we want our volunteers to have in the community is happening to the extent we want it to have. And so there are different ways of measuring. Obviously, counting hours or even keeping track of time is pretty simplistic. But how do we know whether or not the way we've set the volunteer program up is encouraging retention and people coming back, or is creating problems. That gets to be a little more tricky. It's not a counting thing. We're looking for outcomes, actually, that we need to get some subjective information on. So you can just see right here in this, let me see if I can make this bigger for my own sake, if not for yours. You can see right here in this first form, the first thing it says is the volunteer input is encouraged. There is a formal means of receiving feedback. So this is just a comprehensive volunteer program evaluation that they've put together. And they're basically saying, just tell us, are these things in place? So these are best practices: volunteer input and feedback, volunteers encouraged to try new things, volunteers provided with letters of reference, volunteers are appreciated regularly, there are regular volunteer meetings, in-services, or training sessions. Now, that is just what this particular group felt like needed to go into this category of appreciation and support. Not everybody is going to be providing all of their volunteers with letters of reference. That might not be there. And some people might want to do a whole evaluation of volunteer appreciation and not just have it as, you know, like this one line right here, but have its own box. And let's just go down though. You can see that they are looking at boards and procedures. They're looking at the cost of doing a volunteer program and whether adequate money has been allocated. They're looking at what they're calling coordination, facilitation, and I think that's their volunteer engagement person, volunteer manager, whatever you want to call them, coordinator in this case. And now they've got a whole section of things that they're looking at to see whether or not the volunteers are evaluated and how they're evaluated, and whether or not the staff participates, and so on and so forth. All right, so this is great. What they're basically looking for here is to see if, say you've got it says volunteers participate in the assessment process. Say you don't have that done yet. You mark not in place, somewhat in place. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's a thing we always do. It's in place and you check it off. Still, this is great, but it does not get you to the qualitative data that you might need. In that case, you would want to be going back, for example, to the staff members in your organization and also to your volunteers and asking them a couple of simple survey questions. You might use an email Survey Monkey to say, do you feel like you are well integrated with staff? What would you like to see different? How well do you feel you know the staff, and how often do you work with them? I don't know. It would just depend on what you want to know. But there's going to be a lot of things that you want to know that have to do with impact, that it's not just a matter of do we have a policy in place or do we do a thing. It's how well are we doing it? Is the way we're doing it giving us the results we want? All right. All right, so I have now flipped over. I turned the video off for a minute. I flipped over to, I believe it's the ISTAT. It's not a very pretty document the way it's laid out, but it's got a lot of really good information in it. And I am down on page 11, where it talks about effective techniques to use. It suggests surveys, which is something I just mentioned, questionnaires that you can give to, say, volunteers before they start working on an event and then after it's over. Data reporting is what we were talking about earlier, how many volunteers showed up, how many hours, how much money was spent, if you fed them, how much did that cost, you know, that kind of stuff. A case study is actually taking notes and writing them up about how that experience went. I think if you're doing something for the first or second time and you're rolling out a new program, there's always going to be something you can learn from the first time that could improve on the second, and from the second to the third. And one of the great ways to keep track of that is by doing a case study write-up. I think a lot of people object to that because it takes time, but it's also priceless the next time you have to go do it, to go back and revisit your notes and plan to avoid any problems that came up the first time. The thing about consultations, they're talking about having outside people come in and observe. And sometimes when you've been doing something the same way for so long, you're no longer objective, and that's a great idea. All right, and then this content or process analysis is basically trying to get people who understand what you're doing to come in and look at your program step by step and see how it's working. All right, now I have scrolled even further down. Yeah, I'm on page 17. And I just want to show you some examples of outcome evaluation measures. And I like these because they're actually making up, like real, I don't know if they're making them up, but they're what would they really look like. So outcomes are basically, they call them outcomes. I would like to think of them as impact. So if you went through a program somewhere, how much of a difference did it make in your life? That's what we mean by outcomes or impacts. So this first outcome objective, and then they're going to talk about what are you trying to measure, what do you need to know, how are you going to measure it, and what do you think is acceptable. So outcome objective, youth who remain in a mentoring program for 3 months will have a positive, trusting relationship with an adult. So they've decided that they think 3 months of mentoring will, create that bond that they are hoping will be there. Now, how do they assess that? They basically assess the relationships at 3, 6, and 12 months using a questionnaire that is administered by the caseworker to the youth, to the parent, and to the mentor to try to get a holistic look at how that's going. I think it's interesting that the outcome objective only calls for 3 months, but they are being optimistic and assuming that those mentorships will go on for at least a year, and they're making plans to do 3 measures, 3 assessments a year. Okay, so here's what they are looking for. This is what makes them feel like they're doing a good job. 80% of the youth, 70% of the mentors, and 75% of the parents should express satisfaction and believe that the kids benefited from the mentoring relationship. I don't know whether those are arbitrary numbers or not, but that's what they're shooting for. If they find out that, let's say they don't get those numbers, let's say 60% of the youth and 50% of the mentors and 65% of the parents express satisfaction, they're not where they want to be. So then they have to design more information gathering to try to figure out what is going wrong. So I think that maybe they could do something like, for every time that they see somebody say that it's not working out the way that they thought it was going to work out, that they should have a set of questions that they can go back in and ask. What do you wish this looked like for you? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? If you could fix this, how would you do that? Whatever questions will get at finding out the kinds of changes that the program needs to make. All right, so now we've got a volunteer focus. The first one was talking about the youth as the client. So let's look at the volunteer. It says object, volunteer phone counselors will be well trained and feel prepared to provide direction when they answer calls on the hotline. All right, so our objective is to make sure that our counselors are adequately trained so that they can be useful to callers on the hotline. How are we going to measure that? Well, the counselors are going to assess the training, their own training, after 6 months on the job. Meaning they're going to say, yeah, the training that I got was what I needed in order to do these calls, or I've had a whole boatload of calls come in that I was totally not prepared for. If you get that kind of answer, again, you have to drill in deeper. Well, what kind of questions came in? What other kind of training would have been helpful for you, etc. The performance standard that they are looking for is that 70% of volunteers who have answered the calls for 6 months feel satisfied and well prepared. So, all right, so you get the idea, and obviously you're supposed to read all this, so hopefully if you have any questions, you will ask. All right, so let's talk for a minute about evaluating individual volunteers. All right. I've switched again to a goal setting article from Volunteer Hub, and I will flip it up onto the Blackboard so you can have access to it. But it's not so much the article, it was that I was looking for this little list that you can see that starts right here, specific. Yeah. What you want to do with your volunteers is you want to sit down with them in their early training and make sure they understand their job description. But you also want to set goals for them, and you want those goals to be within reach, because you want them to be satisfied that they are succeeding. But you also want them to be concrete enough that everybody's expectations are the same. So they've got an acronym here, SMART. Specific. Your objectives for your volunteers should be tightly focused and concrete. Measurable. You have to figure out, again, just like we were looking at before, how are you going to assess whether or not your specific objective has been met. Attainable, and that's what I just said. You want to make sure the bar is not unrealistically high, because we want to attain it. And if we have a long way to go from where people start in their learning to where we ultimately want them to be, then we should chunk it. We should set goals that they can reach, and once they get there, they'll feel great about it, and set them the next goal, and they'll know that they can do it. Sometimes if you make the goal too up there and too far away, people basically feel like they just want to stop, and they want to stop because they're afraid they'll never make it. So try to make your goals attainable. Relevant. Your volunteer program objectives, how we figured out how the job itself helped achieve to the mission. I think you want to measure that. You want to make sure that you can tie directly some way the work of the volunteer to the work of the organization, the mission of the organization. And then finally, time-oriented. You want time frames on these things. People want to know they have a month or 3 months to achieve whatever it is you've set out for them to achieve. And so you set these goals up, these different objectives, and the ways you're going to measure them. You set these up all in the beginning, and then you go back and touch base during your supervisory opportunities to see how people are feeling about whatever these goals are. We saw in the other article that the goal was for people to feel comfortable answering the hotline phone. So that's the kind of goal you could set for people to feel comfortable doing whatever tasks you've given them, or for people to have adequate training and so forth. Okay, so as you probably could tell by looking at the syllabus, your concrete activity for this week, there are two. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of monotone because I'm so sick here, but the first thing that you're going to be doing is taking one of the job descriptions, one of the roles that you developed, and develop a set of evaluative tools. And I have given you in the folder, the week 15 folder, I have given you all kinds of examples. Just open those folders and look at the stuff I've got, and find one that looks appropriate or like you would like to use. If you need to, make it more specific to what you're doing and adjust it a little bit, that's fine. But find one that works for evaluating your particular role. Find a template, and then build in the requirements around these issues of objectives, how you're going to measure them, etc., into your evaluation procedure. There are lots of examples of already finished ones there, and I think that if you take a look at those, you will see what it is I'm looking for. And I apologize because I'm really not feeling good at all, and my head is fuzzy, so I don't know if these videos are fuzzy, but it's 20 minutes almost, and I'm going to stop and let you guys get going with that. The second project will be to do the same thing, but not for the volunteer, but for a volunteer program based on the organization that you've been working on studying. And I will leave you some written instructions that are clearer than I am. And there you have it. And I will, if you have questions, please, by tomorrow I should have some wits about me. And I will be happy to answer them. You can email me or we can talk during the week. Thanks. Bye.